So I'm Sophie Lesfer, I'm the Interim Chief Officer for Customer and Local Services.
And I'm Nicola DeJesus, Head of Customer Experience for Customer and Local Services.
Thank you. And thank you for coming and finding the time to answer our questions. A Public Accounts Committee is in the middle of the handling and learning from the complaints review. And the main focus of this public hearing is to understand how the implementation of recommendations from PAC report and CNAG report of handling and learning from the complaints and feedback work in practice, what's changed, and how the overall implementation effectiveness of the customer feedback and policy and management systems do work. So I'll start with couple general questions. How do you think the current customer feedback management system and associated processes are performing?
I think they are performing well. Our system we have from a customer perspective, we've got different ways that customers can give us feedback. The key thing is that we'll take feedback in any form. A very popular route is the online form, where we get feedback from customers that's a simple, easy to use form, and it's popular to use. They can also give feedback face-to-face, telephone, in person, in those different routes. Behind the scenes, in terms of how we administer that feedback, we have a system that we call the Customer Feedback Management System. That is automatically linked with the online form, and that is where government colleagues will log feedback that's received, whether it be a complaint, compliment, suggestion, comment. And I believe that system is fit for purpose, it's performing well, it's a system that it's been built in-house by our digital services colleagues. They've recently undertaken a review of that service, that sort of more independent review has concluded that it is fit for purpose. We do obviously have a regular programme of enhancing the system, and so there's been some recent updates which have helped from a usability perspective for colleagues, and that sort of thing. So from a system perspective, I think everything is in a good place. From a process perspective, we do have an annual review of our customer feedback policy, and we've also got a cross-government customer experience board. And we have a group of departmental feedback managers across all departments, and they work well as a network of colleagues from different areas. There's both individual meetings and group monthly meetings, and in that group they will talk about things like system functionality, any ideas for improvements on processes, what's working well, what could be improved on. And that is a useful group to also give us that assurance that we'd be knowing how things are going.
I think you mentioned the corporate and other departments. Can you please expand how the process? I understand that the CLS, Customer Local Services, I will continue to CLS through the public hearing for the benefit of the public. It's Customer and Local Services, and we use CLS. How you oversees the process across the government, or you're not oversees the process across all the government?
So we hold a position as we're almost sort of probably feedback or complaints team. So it's very much the responsibility of relevant departments to manage and respond to their own feedback. But we are there to support if things are needed. We do act as the conduit for if something is submitted via an online form. Often a customer, it might relate to a couple of areas, or they might not actually even know which department of government their feedback refers to. So that's where we will help make sure we act as a sort of triage function, and therefore we make sure it gets to the right departmental feedback manager. So we almost do the administration behind the scenes that a customer doesn't necessarily need to know about, but that is our very constant focus. The one area of government where there is a slight difference is within the health department, who do run with a DATIC service. So customers can still use the online form, and that feedback gets passed on straight away to health. But health do, for good, valid clinical reasons, they use a system that is well known across very similar health systems.
In terms of SCLS interacting with other departments, what would you think things that works well, and what things that you are working on improvements?
In terms of how we
interact with other departments and focusing on customer complaints and customer across the whole government,
yes, so
on the corporate level.
That's it. I mean, this might be one. It might be useful for Nicola to come in, because Nicola actually is responsible for all of those relationships. Sure. So if you want to expand
so I
on
think
your role.
relating to that and what you said before in terms of that oversight and what we do is obviously we're kind of the as Sophie referred to before, where people see as a centre of excellence. So we provide the expertise and advice and support. So, for example, we have quality assurance processes in place
for all other departments, or for your department?
For all departments. So we're our quality assurance process. Other departments do the quality assurance checks on their feedback. And what we do is provide support and advice in terms of how best practice looks, what good complaint handling looks like, what's going well, and then what areas for improvement there may be. And that's what Sophie was referring to before, that monthly meeting that we have with the departmental feedback managers, as we called them, because they're representatives from each department, and also the customer experience board, is where those conversations take place in terms of what's going well and what could be done better. So that's where the conversations take place.
Do they take your feedback and you see the outcome different after a month?
So,
I mean, you give the feedback, you give support, you give advice,
yes.
You meet monthly, and for example, you say health is outside of your scope. If health doesn't listen to your recommendation, what happened next?
So when sorry, can I just continue? Yeah, and in terms of those improvements, how we see that is in terms of those areas coming back to us and saying, this is what we've done. So say, for example, I don't know, an area is we can improve our communication with the individual providing feedback. We would then be able to see that in the quality assurance scores, if they've improved or not. So that's where, and if there's any issues, that is then raised to the customer experience board, who are more senior members of the organisations, to then escalate appropriately. So in terms of those improvements, they are being seen over a period of time and looked at to see what improvements are made.
All improvements are logged and they need to be accountable for implementing or not implementing these improvements?
So we're talking about two different types of improvements, I think. So are you talking about improvements from individual pieces of feedback, just if you can clarify, or are we talking about improvements in complaint handling? Because quality assurance is about the actual complaint handling process.
I think it's important for us to both. You have a feedback processes and you have complaints processes.
Yeah.
Both are the processes are important to the public. When you said the health is not under you, you are centre of excellence. Would you give feedback about, would you suggest improvements only about feedback, or you would suggest improvements about complaints and feedback?
So absolutely.
Yeah, so I think one of the things, for example, that by having a network where we can share examples, and this goes both at a departmental feedback manager level, but also at an ELT level, at different levels of the organisation, is we do things such as trying to learn and improve based on, it could be on a single department's examples, but it could also be wider, and that's where to actually think. So there's things we do such as in your shoes, customer stories. So it might be that one month that the example at the customer experience board or the departmental feedback manager meeting is a health example. That doesn't mean that it's only health who can learn from that and improve. So by having this network of cross-government people, the key thing that we're trying to do and encourage is that getting different people in different areas of the organisations to think, okay, well, actually, is there something here that I can apply to my own learning? And I think that we do always try and centre ourselves around customer stories. Every meeting will usually have, an example, and sometimes they might be small, sometimes they might be big, but it's it's not a matter of us being very necessarily prescriptive of you must do A, B, and C. It's actually that almost discussion for that joint learning to actually reflect.
Yeah.
Sure. Just to carry on, you're obviously the face of government effectively, aren't you, at CLS? So when a customer comes into there and they make a complaint of some description, they won't actually know sometimes which department it is that affects them. So obviously one of the issues will be is you obviously feed that back into the relevant department and things like that. How does that customer know that, you know, if they don't get relevant feedback, they don't get the answer that they want from a certain, how is that coordinated?
So that is our customer feedback policy, where we do a really important thing is, first of all, acknowledging that feedback. I mean, the first thing we will always try and do is resolve feedback at the point it's given. If we can take things seriously, we still want it to be logged because there's actually often learning in that. But if we can resolve something there and then, that is absolutely the best place. But we recognise that's not always possible. So in that case, if someone would come in and give us some feedback, perhaps about another area of government, something that the individual who's receiving that feedback, that's not within their scope to be able to resolve there and then, that's where within our system, that feedback is logged, it's automatically then triaged directly to the relevant place as to someone who can then take ownership of it. Within the customer feedback policy, it's really important that we have sort of timescales around acknowledgements, about when responses should be handled, and almost that's why having a central system means we can keep a watch on it. So that is the sort of thing that customer and local services will also be like, hang on, that complaint's been logged and there's, you know, for 4 days now, can we check, is it in hand? Is there something? So almost the system gives that visibility to the central customer feedback manager to be able to make sure it's being, whereas in the old world, an email might have been sent and there was no means of actually knowing how it was.
I'll probably ask a very quick question. So I hope you have, I mean, if you don't have data, please supply less data a bit later, but I hope you do have it. For the benefit of the public and for the benefit of the committee, if you don't have data for 2024, I'm assuming you have data for 2023. How many total numbers of feedback that was given? How many total complaints? So if you can give us some statistics, it would help us to progress.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We actually have within departments, we have a live dashboard. So almost each day I can know what the figures are. The figures that I've got here is our latest pack that went to the executive leadership team. So this will be at the end of Q3.
So this is for
2024.
Okay.
Yeah.
For the Q3, Q1, quarter one, quarter two, quarter three.
So for example, in 2024, we've had 1,036 pieces of feedback received. Of that, that's actually this is
by customers, these ones.
Yeah, so these are this is the right figure.
Yeah.
So yes, and of those, that makes up 544 of those were logged as compliments, which was feedback that was documented through the system as a compliment. 352 of those were complaints. 97 were comments and 43 were suggestions. Broadly, our volume of feedback does stay fairly static. We do sometimes see trends where there might be a slight sort of peak. Sometimes we'll do a campaign or you know, we'll really make sure we're trying to encourage feedback in a particular area that will lead to spikes.
Just on that one, does it include complaints or feedback for SIPes?
Yes.
Yes.
Does this numbers include feedback complaints for health?
Yes.
Sorry,
So we've got total volumes. So yes.
Total volumes across all governments?
Across government.
Yes, just with the
Sorry.
Philip first, yeah.
Really good
Recorded,
that you,
remember. Sorry, apologies.
really good that you have an equal balance of compliments and complaints. Looking at the compliments, Do you have an analysis of what was really good about the service and how do you deal with that information?
Yes, and that for us is really important that we do have that balance, because I think, and that's why we do encourage, compliments are logged, because sometimes it's about learning where we're doing things really well. And we often talk about doing things from a customer story perspective. Is actually, sometimes those can be things where someone is saying, that service has just, inspired me, changed so much for me, and actually it's like, right, hang on, yeah, we got things right here, let's try and learn to make sure we keep doing that. So the compliments are, there's a part about sort of internal celebration, recognition, that sort of thing, but actually there is also that serious point of you can also learn some really good insights from our compliments.
Can you give me some examples of
Yeah.
what generally goes really well?
Yeah.
Yes.
So the biggest, in terms of compliments and positive feedback, it's how it makes a difference to people. So how we make people feel is the general theme. So it's, when we look at our feedback, it's about how someone was treated, how they were communicated with, so that, customer service really, obviously I know that's like kind of a generic umbrella. So when people feel listened to, heard to, that's all the positive feedback that we receive. And a lot of the time people, and this is why we, a focus for us is celebrating positive feedback, because it's showing value to the individual who's received that feedback. A lot of members or islanders take time to provide that feedback, so ensuring that we pass that on to the relevant person if they've named an employee. And equally, internally, as I said, we do have our own, like CLS particularly, we have our own recognitions where we do living our values. So we can put in nominations to employees where we've heard feedback from different customers. So, but it's generally about how we make people feel that's important, that makes a difference.
Thank you.
Also, just put perspective, on those numbers. So that what is the total interaction on that over that year? What's the number of people, number of interactions in the ground? What percentage does this represent, in other words?
So, yeah, I don't have that number for you, but I suppose even if we think of, in Lamott Street at the moment, we typically get 800 people a day. We'd probably have 800 phone calls a day. The health service obviously have high volume. So I suppose a big focus for us is it's a very small percentage compared to the number of transactions
That's
that there
the point
are.
I was trying to get to.
But equally, we do have other means of also gathering feedback. So, for example, it's not just about, so what I've mentioned here is sort of complaints, compliments, that sort of thing. We've got other measures such as customer satisfaction measures, which are just as important to us from a learning perspective. And that, for example, is at the end of every phone call. If you phone the tax office or phone customer and local services, customs, these places, you get a short survey at the end saying, how satisfied were you with the service you received today? And that's also a really important daily touch point of how are we doing. And we're doing really well on that perspective. We're exceeding our targets. We're in a government overall this year is about 87% satisfaction. And I think that it's different because also there can be things there that we pick up that might just be small things that we can catch them almost before they get to the point of being logged as a complaint. But the other thing we really want to focus on is, we know that this data is very, it's what's logged in the system. So we've done a lot of kind of internal communication, making sure colleagues are aware of how you log feedback and why it's important. Do I think that there's some complaints or compliments that have happened that haven't been logged? I would say there probably are, but it's almost like we can only learn and deal with that we know, and that's what our big kind of focus and promotion is on, almost trying to even log those complaints that you've perhaps handled straight away is to help us get that big picture. So I do think that's been a big focus, and actually this year for the first time the CEO's put into chief officer objectives around some different elements around complaints handling, but one of those measures is around the volume of complaints logged by colleagues, and that is almost to try and, it's to get away from a sort of a sense that a high complaint number is a bad thing. We really want to get to a point that we welcome feedback. We need to know.
How many complaints by colleagues were logged?
So in we have it.
We have
on
it
this,
somewhere. Second.
I'll let Nicola look
Yeah,
for it,
I'll
and I'll
look
just
for it.
finish my sentence.
Sorry.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
So for us, that's a really, it's actually trying to make sure that
Got it here.
that colleagues feel empowered to make sure that we log things, so that we can also do that following it through to make sure a trail isn't lost and that suddenly someone's given feedback and we don't know, but also so that we can learn thematically. So I do think there is, I'm not saying things are perfect, but I think when I look at how we've progressed in the last 3 years, we've made really significant improvements, and we've done some, Nicola's team have done some really good sessions with different parts of government teams where we've almost identified this is feeling, it's almost like, right, do we think what the insight that we're getting is actually reflective of what's happening on the ground? And we've done some focus sessions in some areas where we thought we actually need to go in and really just try and help make sure people understand how the system works, understand the value and the importance, and that's the kind of thing we're continually working on. Nicola's probably got that number.
That's for Q3. So the volume of complaints across government logged by members of staff was 137 for Q3.
By the way, we will move now for different direction, but just to understand, the number that you gave me, 1,036, was it for Q3 or it was for all three quarters?
Q3. But we can, Q3.
I thought
That's
that was
Q3.
rolling.
So
Okay.
1,036, it's only for Q3.
Yes, but we can give you the
yes.
other ones.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
later we'll ask
Okay.
follow-up with
Okay,
information,
fine.
we'll go, yeah.
I think what's just been said is very useful, because now it comes to the feedback you give ourselves, basically in the recommendations that have been provided to yourself from CNG and ourselves at the PAC, specifically on the tasks in handling and learning from obviously the complaint process. We're looking at certain information on our recommendations, recommendation number 2 and number 6, that had target dates of the 30th of September 2024, were they actually met? And if not, why not?
Maybe you
Yes,
Remind-
so that's it.
Yes,
My understanding is we've all recommendations apart from recommendation 1 is our only outstanding complaint at the moment. So recommendation 2 was about the roles and responsibilities. Is that just checking we're talking about the same one, about roles and responsibilities for ensuring around the complaints register, the renewed focus on capturing lessons learned from complaints? We're talking about the same one. Yes, so we've done lots of key work in that. That is a closed recommendation from our perspective. Part of that whole, that lessons learned is almost what I described. That wasn't in place at the time, Linda's last review around the whole kind of customer story being at every meeting, it's surprising how it has been quite a, it's harder than it sort of you might think to actually try and do that sort of corporate lessons learned. So it has taken us, I was involved in the 2020 review as well, and when we were kind of really committed to try and doing it then, and I think we probably hadn't made quite as much progress as we'd have liked by the time of the second review. But I would say now with Nicola and her team's focus, and that we've got real kind of ELT support in this area, and recognising where we've got to, that
Do you have an example of some sort of idea, just so we've got confidence in what you're actually saying? Because there's a lot of fluff above that I'd like to understand.
Of lessons learned.
Yeah, just give us an idea and how that's basically been implemented.
Yes,
Just,
so-
even if it's just a single department, just to understand that.
The kinds of things that we've, from the kind of corporate learning, that this was kind of from the last, last month, from kind of customer stories, we've got the kinds of stories that were discussed. There was kind of some customer journeys around some payments involving a couple of different departments and payment issues, that kind of thing. And there was also sort of customer stories around sort of almost consent and who could know what and this sort of thing, just to give the context. And so learnings that have been taken, key thing is around that, the importance of accountability and responsibility in problem solving. And that's something, it might sound straightforward, but especially this, this sort of really making sure through all levels of the organisation that we kind of recognise that it's really important that someone is taking accountability when a problem arises, and not, people are not getting passed between teams. So almost especially when something's going wrong, we have seen too many examples in the past where it's like, well, okay, the person who they're actually telling that to, it wasn't that person or that specific team who caused the problem, but ultimately that customer is here now with a problem. So that sort of accountability. There's also been learnings on that importance.
Can you please pause on that one? Because I would like to really understand, like Glenn asked in details, is that there is a payments that needs to be made across the departments. You realize the departments pointed to each other. You realize this is the theme that arises, it's not one-off.
Yeah.
What is different now, in simple words, in simple English?
Yeah. So
what's the solution?
So, for example, in my department, we've run a real focus. I've stood up and done, a kind of, as part of a quarterly briefing, we always have, what is our key thing to focus on? And one of them has been, the key theme for the last few months has been own your customer. And that has then come through, we're giving examples, we're celebrating specific success. The Minister is really championing this, especially almost linked to when we're going to be moving to the new building soon. Actually, this whole, if we can make sure that we can work together, but whether it's even within different teams within our own department, there's been some examples where someone has been talking to one team, but then actually it's like, oh no, you've got to talk to this other team, and as a result of that, that feedback, we've really now championed this culture of, own your customer, and we're having some really good tangible improvements as a result. And we are recognising that success. We're giving examples. We're talking about it at different levels of management meetings. So I think that's a kind of example where we've done something different and we're getting better
With
results.
the way that everything's tracked, obviously, it sounds like everything is quite positive. From our perspective, what improvements can be made from how we discuss things with yourselves? Obviously, we've got that tracking recommendations. Is that something that you feel could be built on, improved on, that would help that whole process, and then what comes back to ourselves?
Yes, I think, I suppose from my perspective with this review, it felt we were in a good position where the recommendations were quite clear. Yeah. We knew what we needed to do. We just needed to get on and do them. And that's what we've now done. I mean, we're just as pleased to be in a position where there's only one recommendation outstanding, because we feel like we're doing them for us. We're not really doing them for you. So I think it's, from our perspective, we've both times for the complaints reviews that we've had, we've almost treated the implementation of the recommendations almost as a project, and there's been kind of monthly focus. We've had people from different departments. We all come onto a monthly call. We're held accountable by Nicola, who will be kind of like, right, where are you up to with this? What's your timescale? And actually, it's almost, so from our point of view, that's where, and then after that meeting each month, we make sure the tracker's updated. So
can I just say, I found it really helpful, to be honest, from my perspective. I think in terms of feedback or the world of customer experience and how I see it as an islander myself, we're always looking for continuous improvement. So getting that feedback and then being able to have clear recommendations on aspects that, I was reviewing.
Encouraging people to think, well, that's not the customer's fault.
Yes,
so it's almost behind the scenes, you can be negotiating, trying to work out how to resolve it. But I suppose our big focus is put yourself in the customer's shoes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That it's not helpful for the customer to be like, well, I'm trying to talk to you, but I don't, like, they almost don't know where to
Yes,
go. And sometimes that's where we really want to have that culture of, okay, yes, you might not be the right person, but actually you've got a better chance of solving this than the customer sort of going on a perhaps wild goose chase themselves. So that's where we're almost giving that permission to people to say, this might be slightly out of your normal remit, but actually this is
Take responsibility, basically.
yeah.
And just a minute, we're trying to be sincere because we want to go through the questions. Yeah.
One tiny little thing, and that was just in terms of training. I mean, does this highlight gaps in skill gaps and people's awareness and knowledge? Is that a kind of a very proactive approach you take to
And that's what I
some of that?
think we have a really good programme of training that's, we've got different levels around we've got sort of introductory level training, which is very much about like the basics of the policy, how to record a complaint, that sort of thing. We've got our customer service skills training, our early resolution of complaints handling, complex complaints training. And the key thing is that these are delivered on a sort of fairly regular cycle, but they never quite stay the same from one session to the next, because what we do is we feed into them learnings from the previous quarter or 6 months. So for example, in the complex complaints training, it's not just sort of hypothetical off the shelf examples. It's real, anonymised, but it's real examples looking at what actually responses were. And I think we keep those fresh. And I think that keeping that training current is really important.
Sorry,
Thank
can
you.
I just add, in addition to that, sorry.
Yeah, let's try just to keep
Yeah,
our answers
just-
succinct. Yeah.
Just in supporting that regular training, obviously we deliver ad hoc in terms of where the needs and the gaps in the organisation are. And going back to your previous question about, that culture of owning your customer, that's where a lot of the focus is islanders don't care which government department they go to. The important thing is that customer journey and customer experience. So I can speak from my own experience in terms of how I deliver the training. It's about understanding that journey and experience, and we're all there to provide that service and good customer service. So the training, the focus, the whole culture and mindset, that's what supports that whole own your customer behind the scenes.
Thank you.
Just on this one, a very short point, how do you assess the training is effective? And
Yep.
then I have another one to the previous one.
Yes, so we do, after all training, we do sort of pre-course evaluation, post-course evaluation, and we were actually just looking this morning at the different outcomes of that. And, I'm pleased to say it's really good evaluation. We get success, but I think also we expect to see, and we have done, increases in, for example, our quality assurance scores. So we're regularly quality assuring, sampling different complaint responses, how things were handled. We expect, we find, if we find things in there that are not quite as they should be, we train on them, and we should expect to see those sorts of things go up, which they have been doing.
Okay, and just a question which I feel is important for the public. On the previous one, when you said that even in the handling process of complaint or any sort of complaint might not be the customer's fault. So what process is currently in place for situations where during a complaint it's clear that the departmental error has negatively impacted the claimant? And what are you doing to remediate that or to improve this process?
So that's where I think it really comes down, a lot comes down to communication with customers. If we've done something wrong, we absolutely need to apologise, explain to the customer what went wrong, and actually explain to the customer what we're going to do as a result. In sometimes, depending on the situation, based on our feedback with customers, that apology and recognition is actually what they sort of are looking for. But I think what's really important is that they can then know we're putting things in place to try and stop this happening again.
But what about when the impact is affecting financially or health-wise as well?
I suppose that would all very much depend on the circumstances. It's that would be the person who. This is where, for example, our work, we don't. From a customer experience point of view, we're not getting into the specifics of an individual complaint, but the person who is leading, if there's been a financial impact, that would be for the person who's leading on that complaint to make
There is a
appropriate
process
decisions.
of redressing or anything financial.
So I'd say there's, within the customer feedback policy, there is, something around redress, but I think it's very much dependent on what the service is, what the, the implications are. So there's not one, that's very much for the person who's leading that complaint handling to decide what is appropriate.
A very two quick question before we're moving to different theme, and for Philip. So the first question, when you mention training, is it training for CLS or you're doing the training for all departments?
Government-wide.
Government-wide,
yes.
and it's led by your department?
It's coordinated by the People and Corporate Services Department.
Okay.
We very much support that because it's corporate training. It's the
corporate training,
but,
yeah.
But like Nicola
then
does
our
a lot
team.
of it, of the actual delivery, for example, as well.
No, the question was corporate or not corporate, it's clear. And second one, on implemented recommendations that has been done, we talked about that it should be easily accessible. So the people who, they follow post complaints process,
Yeah.
it's implemented. If people didn't provide their email address,
Yeah.
how do you get feedback post-complaint process?
So we now will write to them if they've given us an address, if they've given us a phone number, we'll give them a call.
So everyone would receive or telephone call or letter or email?
Yeah, that's one of the
changes.
That's one of the changes since the.
I'm just
review.
checking
So,
the changes
that's
have
the-
been implemented,
The vast
okay.
majority
Is
still,
email.
is still email,
Yeah.
but we absolutely will letter or phone call
Good.
as
Yeah.
required.
Helpful, thank you. So we move.
Okay, thank you. It's all very interesting, thank you. I was struggling to begin with, looking for the policy.
Oh, okay.
I think I found something
Right.
that could be a policy,
Okay,
and it's on the government website.
yes,
Always a good
gov.je
place to look.
/feedback.
And one of the purposes is to ensure we have a consistent approach, to ensure complaints are dealt with in a fair, unbiased, timely and confidential manner. And we have a feedback system that tells us how well that's operating.
Yeah,
And you've told us that you have summaries that come through of the results for each individual department, and you can monitor the progress of comments and complaints as it's going through. So in a term of real-time basis, is that how you keep in touch with how well complaints are being handled?
yes, I would say personally now in my role, I'm probably not on a sort of day-to-day basis. That's Nicola and her team and the relevant teams within different departments. But certainly as, for example, a leader within CLS, I'd expect kind of to be able to each week, each month know, have we got any things that are outstanding that shouldn't be? Like we'd be monitoring within our own, we've got different senior leadership forums, we've got different management meetings where actually we'd be reviewing any feedback, any lessons learned, any particular hot topics. And then at an executive leadership team level, we have a quarterly slot. It's always balanced against the risk slot. So colleagues who lead on risk also, it's always kind of at the same meeting. And that works really quite well because it's almost making sure that any from our customer insight, that's always, a useful discussion about like, what are we learning? But actually, are there any risks emerging? And actually, it kind of balances quite well against the risk log. But in reality, is that any chief officer at any point or different people, there is a dashboard where people can see their own, what's appropriate for them to see. They can, their own department's data, they can see at any point, they could log in and see, actually, these are the 5 complaints that are outstanding, or this is the compliments we've had in this week. And that is all available, and different people use that in different ways.
So how the departments actually know how well that feedback is being handled, as it's being handled?
So,
I understand that you wouldn't necessarily know.
no, that's
but
it.
the
So
people on the
what
ground
they
probably
can see
should
is the system does. So there's a few things around. So timeliness is actually a really important thing, and communication for customers. And we actually, one of the biggest learnings, I think, from talking to customers is that if they're kept in touch with, they don't necessarily expect everything to be done at absolutely breakneck speed, as long as they know when they're going to get a response, when they're next going to hear from us. But our policy does, it's all focused on trying to resolve things quickly, treating complaints as a priority. So the system, for example, has got, if you were to log in as a particular department, you'd see your relevant department's feedback, and it turns red when it's a day away from the SLA. So it's kind of, there's an obvious, hang on, do we know what's happening here? And that departmental feedback manager would be calling the person saying, just checking, are you on this? Have you spoken to the customer? That sort of thing. Is that what you were?
I think it was. I was sort of following. I don't know very much about it, and
Yeah.
you do.
Yeah,
So,
no.
if I'm going to, are there specific people responsible for handling customer feedback within departments, or is everybody responsible?
So
for it?
there is a role which is we call the departmental feedback manager, and there is a departmental feedback manager in every department, and their role is kind of oversight of complaints. So it doesn't mean they're responsible in the sense of actually creating, meeting with the customer and creating a written response or having a phone call with them. What they're responsible for sure is making sure we're doing a good job. So they might be liaising with the manager of the team where there's a complaint saying, are you on this? Have you spoken to the customer? Is there anything you need? Is there any, so that departmental feedback manager will be almost coordinating and making sure we're doing what we say we're going to do in the policy, but the actual responsibility for handling feedback rests with the services, which I do think is right, is that when it's about a particular service.
I'm thinking of the individuals. Some people are going to be good at it, some people are going to be bad at it.
Yeah.
The last thing you want is someone who's bad at it,
Yes.
dealing with it. So the departmental feedback manager, they're responsible for making sure the right people are dealing with the with the comments as they come in.
Yes, and I think a big part of what we do is making sure that actually, yes, we have trained people. What sometimes we realise is some areas, they don't have much feedback at all, and suddenly there's one complaint. It comes somewhat out of the blue, and they're not really experienced in how to handle this. And that's where the departmental feedback manager can offer that bit of support, saying, well, actually, let's talk this through. Let's work out what your next steps are. They're not going to actually do it, but they can offer that bit of support. And if we see that someone's not very good at it, that's where absolutely we'd be intervening to say, and even quality assuring after the event, if it's only spotted then, to say, right, let's do a little drains up here. How could this have been done better?
I think you may have intimated the answer to the next question. Okay. You said you act as a conduit,
Yes.
an aggregator almost, and
Yeah.
you then send out the results to the individual departments. And it's then their responsibility to deal with that feedback, not yours.
Yeah.
So, but do you have any responsibility to make sure that they are dealing with it?
Well, I suppose that's where we have the metrics. So we can see if something's not being done. So that's where we'll start with a little nudge, just checking, do we know what's happening here? That sort of thing. And ultimately, the executive leadership team have absolutely given Nicola and her team the permission to escalate things. Yeah. If there is a concern, ELT have clearly said, if there's something that is something in their department looks like it's not quite working, please do escalate. Yeah. I mean, that isn't needed very often. There's actually really good relationships there. But so we wouldn't necessarily leap in and fix it, but we would, we kind of make sure that people are on it. Like, is there a plan for this? This doesn't, and sometimes it might be someone's who was handling a complaint has gone off sick, for example. We would just want to make sure, has this been allocated to someone else? Those sorts of things.
Okay, thank you very much. I must pass back to my chair who's trying to egg us on.
No, it's absolutely fine. So, Nicola, just to make sure, you are the person that's responsible that across the department, if something going wrong.
So at those meetings, they're the issues that I discuss. So we don't wait for it to be months down the line. If there's any issues, I raise it there, and then I obviously raise it with Sophie, and then processes are taken.
But I think we don't find that it's not like there's a high number of things where, because I think we really have come a long way in the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, that actually people want to do this well. I think within government, colleagues are really committed. I think people are starting to see, or not even just starting to see, they really do believe if we can treat complaints handling as a priority and get this right, this helps all of us. You know, we're all, so
I will
so
move to
yeah,
the feedback system, because we do have a couple of things to go through the review,
sure.
and I completely appreciate it. It's nice, it's good to hear the positive and the recommendations were met. Now, integration of SIPes into the customer feedback management system. What worked easy and where were challenges in merging into the broader government system? Because SIPes was outside and it took 2, 3, 4 years since the recommendations that it was integrated.
Yeah.
What worked? What you felt where was challenges?
So I think, yes, it's been a long journey. And I think, though, it's important sometimes that we possibly now, when we look back with hindsight, when we sort of initially rolled out the policy and the system, it was almost kind of like, right, this is, you know, this is how it's going to work. And we probably didn't look at schools in enough of a, like, they are very much their own thing and work differently. And so I think actually that period of time, we then sort of almost, we were focusing on the other departments where this system did work in a much more day-to-day work. So then I think through the focus of actually, it became a really key objective, you know, from the SIPE's chief officer himself, was like, he really wanted to be able to have that central oversight. This wasn't something that even it was just us pushing at a closed door. He was really wanting to make this work. But so I think what worked well this time with this rollout was really taking the time to work with SIPes, and we have made some system adaptations and adjustments, because schools are just not the same as a sub-department of I&E or, you know, or whatever. So I think by having that, I think, and it has been, you know, I would say it's still very early days with SIPes. Well, with schools, sorry.
So does SIPes receive now as a department, when the complaint logged into school, that the SIPes can see the copy and to see the complaint? Because this was the major thing, that department had no idea what's happening at schools. So now it does work.
Yes, that's it.
Okay,
and so a school, it would get triaged. It would go in exactly the same way as if a you know, complaint came in about pensions. It would come in and it would end up with the pension team manager. If a complaint came in about a school, it would end up with the head teacher or the business support manager.
So now when we are continuing to purchase programs or systems that would work across the government, would you take into considerations different operations of the departments when purchasing the system? Because I understand the system actually wasn't built for incorporate different type of operation.
Yes, I think, you know, in hindsight, I think the system that we've got is fine and fit for purpose. If there was an unlimited budget and the opportunity to buy something with far more significant features, you know, we wouldn't say no, but it's almost, it doesn't feel like the right priority. But I think there's definitely been some useful lessons that we've reflected on and almost shared as well in that wider, is around, actually, it's not even just about the system perspective from our schools. Actually, getting the system to work in schools was one major part, but it's even actually about that understanding, well, how would feedback be received? How is it, you know, just even the relationship between head teachers and pupils and parents, and it's different. So I think there definitely are things that we've learned, and I think we'll continue to learn. It's still early days with schools, but it feels like we've made great progress getting them on, and then now it's actually trying to, you know,
Thank you. I'll pass to Deputy Coach.
So what measures have been taken to assess that the online feedback system is working well? And have you had any challenges in collecting or using this feedback effectively?
So by the online system, I suppose that's where we do have an online form, and I would say that is probably our most popular route for people to submit feedback. Typically, it's about 50%. I'm just looking at sort of figures here. We've had almost, you know, 2,000 bits of feedback to date this year, of which about 1,000 have been online. So it's almost, so I think customers like these days, we know in all different ways of life, people like doing things online. And I think we've done work with different customer groups and that sort of thing to actually look at the online form to actually check, is this, does this work for them? Is there any improvements that can be made? We've made some tweaks based on that feedback, but even things that, you know, for us it was really important. We've sort of recently launched sort of the child-friendly complaints policy. It's really important that we have a means that children, and we'd initially sort of gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole thinking we needed to have something quite different for children, but actually when we ran it past children and asked them, they were like, oh, that online form's fine, it's quite simple, it's just, so, you know, so I think that's, it's a popular way of people to use it, and I think the ability that people can submit anonymous feedback online is actually something that people value.
How's the impact with like child friendliness with the process? Obviously, do you want to go back and how's that working? Have we had any sort of
Early days.
early days?
So that's
So is there
it.
any feedback from families and?
That's, I mean, it's been well received by our kind of partners, and kind of, Nicola can talk to this, she's part of like the children's cluster group, which is different children's charities, education, those sorts of things. So I think the one thing I suppose I'm conscious that we've actually had discussions, we don't actually record on our system. We don't ask people their age when they're submitting their feedback, because obviously it's not really relevant, but it means that we don't have a clear sort of, you know, I couldn't say to you, oh, well, since we've done it, we've had this many, but I think it is early days, but do you have anything you want to add?
It's early days, but it has been well received, obviously, from feedback, from like verbatim feedback and conversations that I've had in different areas. And in relation to that, in terms of that system development and enhancement, we are putting in a checkbox, essentially. If you're under the age of 18, tick this box if you're submitting feedback. So in the future, obviously it's only been launched in October, so in the future we'll be able to review and monitor that.
Yeah, and there's a long-term like stability plan there to make
It's
sure
not-
that this keeps on going forward.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going back.
How does the government make sure the feedback and complaint system it's easy enough to use for everyone, and what support is available for people who find it hard to make complaints in the usual way?
So I suppose that's what for us is really important, that we continually kind of promote and make clear that complaints can be received in any sort of format. It doesn't have to be via the online form. And so we encourage people to, you know, come in and talk to us, phone us. We have been doing, aside from obviously the child-friendly, we've done some work with looking at actually how can other sort of seldom heard voices, as it were, how easy is it for them to know? And sometimes it's that almost trying to build the trust that actually we appreciate that feedback. So sometimes it's that we want to, it's not even about, you know, how easy or difficult a form is to fill in. It's actually that trying to get past that point of not being scared to tell us that something wasn't as good as it could have been. And that's where I think a lot of the underpinning work that we need to do is not necessarily about the complaint system per se, but is actually building that trust in government as an entity. And so that's where we're doing quite a lot of focus. And that even comes through with the training on, you know, making sure our colleagues in government are empathetic, that people really do realise that we will value things. And I think even people's past experiences of how we've handled complaints and those sorts of things count for a lot. Nicola could probably talk a bit about her sort of cluster groups and the work she's doing with some of those sort of more minority groups.
Yeah, so obviously importantly, it's just making sure we're continuously improving and acting on feedback. As we all know, changing demographics, new communities on island. I'm part of several cluster groups, but equality, diversity, learning disability, and children's cluster. My background is about accessibility and inclusivity as well in terms of my expertise. So we're constantly seeking feedback. So via those cluster groups, making sure people are aware of how to raise feedback, but equally listening to if there's been any challenges, apart from obviously the trust issue and, kind of supporting those things, but understanding, is it that we need to provide things in different languages and how do we do that? Is it that maybe where I go is use the expertise that we have in those cluster groups so they're closer to the communities. So we've used, like Caritas or Salvation Army to then make sure that they then can promote the systems and then provide that feedback back to see where we can make changes. So we're constantly tweaking where necessary and listening to where those improvements can be made. So,
And what is the current process and availability for the ones that only can that way or prefer to complain in person?
so anyone can provide feedback in person to essentially anyone in government. So it's raising that awareness because I suppose our message and the culture that we're obviously trying to develop and educate is that if someone comes to you with a piece of feedback, you take that responsibility and take that complaint and then log it accordingly and then pass that on. So that in person, we kind of welcome anyone to come in person and speak to us. Equally, we provide that support from customer experience where if someone wants to speak to someone independently maybe, then we'll say, oh, we're more than happy to meet with you and then, take your concerns on board. So.
Thank you. So what surveys or measures are used to understand the public trust in the feedback system, and what actions have been taken in the last year after receiving negative feedback around the process?
So I think in terms of get feedback on feedback, I mean, what's really important to us, we touched on it earlier, is actually us asking after every complaint that's closed, we do ask customers how have we done, and actually we can really learn from that. And we've used examples of where people have said really positive things in that survey to help show people that actually you can turn negatives into positives. So you can actually help build trust through handling someone's complaint well. So I think that survey remains important to us, as well as different parts of satisfaction. There's also overall, there's some sort of bigger surveys like the Joel's survey and that sort of thing, which I think offer, the bigger kind of actually how much do you trust government, which again, if we can get all of that sort of underpinning right, that can help. Sorry, can you remind me the second part of your question?
Can you give us one example of what improvements have been done in last year due to feedback?
Okay, yeah, so if I think of some specific example, we had specific feedback on how it was challenging the gender change programme, and also around even just name change, and how there wasn't a kind of joined up approach, even say, for example, change of name. Even if you got married, for example, it was like, oh, well, Revenue Jersey is this one way of doing things. Customer and Local Services is something totally different. And that it just wasn't easy for people to know what to do. So that's a kind of example where we took that feedback on board. It wasn't that difficult. We actually managed to change processes, align things across different departments, and make it a better process.
So just something here about complaints withdrawal. Obviously, sometimes people find it just too hard to make the complaint. They therefore withdraw from this. Obviously, that's another sign that something's not working, something didn't happen quick enough. Are you able to identify how many complaints, whatever, are withdrawn?
We are, but we
do you
don't-
monitor that at all?
Yes, we
don't
do.
have quite
And
No,
some
but
many.
we will follow up with the
Yes,
written
it's-
question,
yeah,
and this is
it's-
a question,
Okay,
but
yeah,
it's
that's
really
fine.
important to
Yeah.
think
We
about the
do have
complaints
that as
Oh, yeah.
data.
And I think it's sometimes complaints get withdrawn for different reasons. Sometimes, like you say, it might be that it's overwhelming, but in many cases, it's actually like sometimes through that initial even acknowledgement, someone talking to someone to say, "Oh, let me understand it more." They actually then realise and actually say, "Oh, actually, I'm going to
Yes.
withdraw it."
Yeah,
So,
sure.
but it is, like you say, it's an important
have that.
metric.
Thank you.
Okay, and my last one before we pass to Deputy Orr. How does CLS evaluate whether the current feedback and complaint system is worth the cost, and have any cost-benefit analysis been done to check its efficiency?
So, from my perspective, you know, actually complaints, and if we don't get this right, it's inefficient and it is a cost that is almost unavoidable. So that's why we do prioritise a focus on complaints. And we do have, I mean, as I say, most of the actual complaints handling itself is done within the relevant teams and that sort of thing. But for example, yes, we do spend money on training people, having, you know, customer feedback manager. But I think if we can, it's such an important service area to focus on that actually we know when we come out the other side, it is good value for money. Handling complaints is an expensive way of doing things. You know, we want to actually move into a much more preventative space and avoid these things. So actually that's sort of focusing on learning lessons. What have we done? How can we prevent this reoccurring or happening elsewhere? So that's kind of how, from a value for money perspective, we absolutely see this as, you know, chief officers will manage
The question
their own.
was kind of...
So what more specifically, like what changes, if any, have been made or can be made to reduce cost while maintaining quality?
Sort of, so there's no, I suppose, do you mean around an actual budget for complaints handling? I'm trying, or do you mean
Like
just
to
in
make it more cost effective, yes.
Yeah, so I suppose, I mean, this isn't an area where we have a big budget line or anything like that. So there's not a kind of, complaints budget of that. So I suppose this is something where, for us, this is almost a core part of business as usual. But we are putting our focus on making sure we are focusing on it quickly. For me, that's something that I think, and you know, chief officers across government, we really are trying to focus on. If we can actually handle complaints swiftly, so it's worth the investment in having someone focus as a departmental feedback manager, for example, because if we let things linger on,
We try to understand specifics, I think,
yes,
Let me help you here.
Yeah.
We invest so much in client handling,
yeah,
in terms of a system implementation, monitoring, departmental feedback managers.
Yeah.
That all has a cost attached
Yeah.
to it. And the real question is, how do we know we're getting full value from that?
Yes.
In terms of speed with which services are delivered, for example.
okay,
Or lack of problems to deal with further on.
yes,
Is there some way that is monitored?
yes.
Or to add to that, as a clarifying point, how do we make sure that most of the complaints are sorted at the first point of contact rather than adding to the cost?
Yeah. So, and I suppose that's what our kind of metrics, that's what we focus on. We look at how many are resolved within 5 days, and that number, you know, that number's really come down since we've had this focus. You know, how many are resolved at the first, you know, stage 1 rather than stage 2 or stage 3.
Have you ever done a cost-benefit analysis?
No, not in a sort of precise form like that, but I suppose
No, the processes are good, and I really
And that's it,
welcome in
yeah.
the processes.
And
I'm asking about specific exercises.
And I suppose just from a cost perspective, our system was built in-house, so we haven't got a kind of ongoing support. You know, we're not paying a contractor or something for that. Our departmental feedback managers they are not all doing this as a one. Often their role will also include some work on governance and some other. So their roles.
There is
are
lots of things happening, and you're
Yes.
thinking that probably there are if I'm understanding correct, there are constraints in the resources, physical and human, to think about the exercise of cost-benefit analysis
I suppose it's just not something that is, you know, we feel that actually what we spend in this area is absolutely reasonable, because it's not big amounts, but it's absolutely the area that is appropriate to focus on, I suppose, is.
No, it's almost.
That almost kind of moves on to the question, which is, are you properly resourced? Have you got sufficient resources to be able to do this?
That's it, and I think,
So,
we our kind of focus is as this sort of centre of excellence to support others is something that, we in CLS have invested in, and I think other departments would acknowledge that our support has kind of helped them because we can satellite in and actually help them see things through another perspective. We've got some good examples of where we've done that in departments recently. And I think in other departments, chief officers obviously make their own resourcing decisions, but they do that according to what they need. So obviously, areas like health, I&E, Treasury, Revenue, Jersey, those sorts of things, the resource levels there are different to perhaps, external relations department, which, it doesn't have the same level. So I think it's almost, this isn't something where there must be X amount of allocated resource. It's about, but the key thing is that we're seeing this as a priority and actually making sure that the resource is appropriate. So I do believe we're in a
resource.
How many people in your team have handling?
So the Nicola's team is a wider team. It handles the customer feedback. It handles wider customer insight, but we also have part of that team, which is our continuous improvement function, which would include, for example, lean practitioners who can go in, look at customer insight processes that aren't working, do kind of remapping of processes and that sort of thing. So we've got people who work on procedures, so it's a broader team than just complaints, but it's about...
There's 10 of us in total.
10 in total.
But
that's not complaints focused.
It's customer experience.
And continuous improvement. So it's both.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is tricky because you're kind of saying what I'm about to ask, and I feel like I might be repeating the question. How is the effectiveness of the customer feedback policy evaluated in quarterly ELTs? I guess that question probably is it in monetary terms, or is it in what metric is what metric is used?
So for us, the policy itself, we formally review it annually, which is done almost through a bottom-up review, starting with actually looking at what we've received during the year. We kind of always have if we get a piece of feedback on it, if it's something that we think needs to be done sooner, we'll act on it. But if not, we kind of store it until the review. So departmental feedback managers, and then the customer experience board, which is cross-government, and then it comes to executive leadership team, and that is really it's not from a monetary perspective that evaluation takes place. It's almost more from how do we feel this is working? So one of the things we've also introduced is really kind of making sure we're going through at the moment is are our other sort of key performance indicators that we're measuring ourselves against, do they feel right? This is always a changing landscape, and we, I think this was Lynn in her report made the point that it's not, just because we set something up as a certain level and metric, we actually do need to keep those metrics under review and check that our targets are appropriate. So it's more that sort of thing rather than from a monetary perspective.
I guess, so I'm going a little bit off here, and I'm going to stop with this last question. And it's really around, what if you did nothing? In other words, what would be the consequences of you not having doing all this work and using all this resource? That's why I'm trying to work out cost.
Yes,
in other words,
that's it. Yeah,
is it? How do you?
So I suppose
how do you evaluate?
Yeah,
that? That you are,
the kind of the thing
it's
of being a long-term civil servant is I was around before we had this kind of way of working in place, and I remember, as from there used to be a web page that had about 12 different things. If you want to make a complaint about planning, click here, and there was a little policy there. If you want to make a complaint about social security, click here. And there was all these different policies, all these different time scales, different ways. Some it had to be in writing, and you might hear back in 30 days. Some it was you could phone us, and it was just so confusing for a customer. Yeah. The complaint volumes also, when we started this process of trying to improve things, there was very few complaints because hardly anything was logged unless it was like a really, really formal thing. But as a result, there was no learning, there was no focus. So I think to go backwards, to move away, would would really be detrimental, because that learning and sharing and that focus has just meant we've got things a lot more out in the open, and almost there are some things that you think, oh gosh, that's not as good as it could be, but at least we know about it and we can tackle it. Back in the old way, you wouldn't necessarily have known,
what's
so you
happening,
couldn't
yeah.
Okay, fine.
be solving it.
Thank you, thank you. So one other point here is around suppliers. So how do you capture complaints and feedback from suppliers and potential suppliers to government?
So that, in a way, would be in exactly the same way. If someone is, making a complaint, and it depends on what service you're offering. So if it might be. Different teams would deal more with, supplies than others, but that would be, you would log that in the system. It would kind of be treated in so I suppose our customer feedback policy, what we're clear on is this isn't just about sort of individual customer transactions. Actually, our customers are also organisations, they can be businesses, they can be visitors, they can be, third sector organisations. So it would actually follow the same process that it should be logged. Whether, they could use the online form, but you'd imagine as a supplier, you'd probably have a direct relationship with someone, and that person in government should then be logging that feedback and handling it accordingly.
Yeah, thank you. Philip, to yourself.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about departments that have good response rates and those who've got very poor, unresolved situations, which I presume are all in sort of stage 3 of your policy.
Yes.
Because that's the stage they've got to, because
Yeah.
time has elapsed. What can you do about, what does that tell you about the particular matters that are being raised in terms of the quality of the way they're being resolved, and what are you doing about it?
Yeah, so I would say, just to confirm, stage 3 doesn't necessarily mean just on time. Stage 3 could be someone has gone through a complaint process and they're not happy with the outcome of a stage 2, so they've asked for it to be escalated to a chief officer level. So it could be for that reason, as well as time. So I suppose from a timeliness perspective, that's something that we do monitor, we can report on. We've actually recently had an important system upgrade, which allows us to keep a track of this in a much better way, because previously there might be good reasons why a complaint, if it's really complex, it might involve a few different parties, it would be absolutely appropriate for everyone involved to say, actually, this is likely to take a few weeks, for example. And the important thing is that the customer stays at the centre of that and agrees to that extension and timescales, and they know when they're going to hear. Our previous system wasn't, the previous iteration, it wasn't complex enough to recognise where an extension had been agreed. One of the recent upgrades means we now know there's been an extension agreed with the customer, so it has taken, for example, 3 weeks, but we're all okay with that because we know what's going on behind the scenes. So if there's cases then now which are showing as overdue, there should have been a response, that's where we'd really just be making sure we're speaking to that department, checking that they're on it, working out what's handling. But I mean, ultimately, it is that department. We'd be making sure that department, have they got the right people involved?
What about in your department?
In my department, so that we're in a good position. I think looking at our quarter 3 statistics, we had 97% of our complaints were closed within the timescales that we'd agreed. So, but if there are those exceptional circumstances, that's where Nicola or the team, for example, if there's something where we think, hang on, we've slipped up here, this is taking longer, this is not appropriate, relevant heads of service would be alerted, and we'd just be making sure, I suppose, we have that culture where we do treat complaints as a priority. We're all very busy people, there's lots going on, but we know that, you know, having learned from experience, I suppose, as well, is that, you know, time saved now, by time put in now to try and resolve this will help prevent further.
So how are complaints about services which are being delivered at the moment being dealt with? You know, customer says, "Well, I'm not happy with this." They said they were going to be here on Thursday.
Yeah.
It's now Tuesday. It's going to be 3 days. Now it's going to be understandably 3 weeks.
Yeah.
How's that handled?
So that's, if someone is sort of saying that, that's the thing, we would log that as feedback. I mean, the key thing, you know, we'd try and do in that situation is get that resolved. We'd actually try and say, where is it? What is happening here? Let's really, like, it sometimes, you know, it sometimes just takes a fresh perspective to go and, you know, shake the tree and say, hang on, look, what has gone wrong here? And sometimes we can find there's something in a process has slipped up, and, you know, often it's about, right, really focus on how can we resolve, you know, depend on what the situation is, how can
department, but it's very much that I suppose our focus and what we prioritise is that customer service skills. If we think about the training and education, customer service skills, getting it right, or as right as positive as possible first time, and then, you know, obviously early resolution, and then it should reduce the number of complex complaints. But obviously that's a journey in terms of the maturity of our organisation, but we are in a positive place.
I must defer to my chair now.
Sorry.
Looking at me.
Could talk forever.
No, I think it's good. I think
Yeah,
that,
it was
Glenn
just
would
based
like
on
to
what
ask.
you might have tried to allude to, Phil, is why then is the unresolved complaint rate for the HSE not reported alongside other departments?
The unresolved.
so
sorry.
that's,
Which bit is that?
So that we do have, as we sort of briefly touched on at the beginning, is that health do run off a different system for very good reasons. And so there is some data that is recorded slightly differently. So they're a department that we don't kind of have that day-to-day liaison with them, because we don't, because they're they've got their feedback team running their own system, but actually they give us their data and their performance, you know, quarterly, to make sure we have it in
So
the
would that be
reports.
part of that then? That
So-
they would report back to you that they haven't resolved?
So that might be one. I will need to double check on that, but it might be one that actually their system records it slightly differently. So I think it might be that.
Again, if that system is recording it differently, is that something you should understand why it does it differently?
And we've made some good progress with actually being able to get the data through the two different systems as aligned as possible, so that we can get.
It's work in progress in terms of making sure that the KPIs as such, or this information that we look like at the customer feedback policy, that we get the same information from health. So we are working on it to make sure that however they need to pull that data out of the system, that, you know, they will then provide that at some point.
Yeah.
But it's because of how they do it at different times of the
Yes,
That
month.
would
it
be
might
useful
be
to
like a
see
technical,
again once you've resolved
logistical-
that.
Yeah, because the unresolved complaints, regardless in
Of
which
where it
system,
sits.
Yes,
and if we are
exactly.
reporting the corporate level, we would need to see unresolved complaint from health. Is it something that we would see in 2025?
That's it. So we'd need to, I'm not close enough to the detail on that particular one to know with health how it's worked, but it's certainly something we can take
Yeah,
away,
okay.
talk to them about, just to check. Is it that they can measure it, but we just haven't
Don't
got
see
the
it, we
data,
don't
or
see
is
it,
it that it's actually a system thing? And I don't want to.
Whatever it is, whatever they divide, it's unresolved complaints, and we're
Yes.
thinking we would like to see it, the public would like to see that we have all data on unresolved complaints in one place.
Yes. So
And
is that our new language? We've recently changed
I don't know, yeah,
our
'cause we've-
definition as well, just to flag on.
which is, do you have different
so
definition
just
for unresolved
for unresolved,
complaints?
Is that I'm trying
I
to.
would need to get back to you, because we looked, it's not necessarily unresolved, it's how we categorise, how we close complaints. So it's just double checking what that information, I don't have it with me. It's not about unresolved, it's about how we close complaints on the system. So we've changed the definition to some of the criteria. but we can get back to you in relation to that of what it was.
Okay, it would be interesting to see what's the different
It's
definition.
just I'm wondering where that unresolved terms come from, I suppose. Would be good to know.
And also, there are high rates in infrastructure and environment. What steps were you undertaking to make sure this is?
Is this in the unresolved?
Unresolved
and is
complaints.
This has presumably come from the pack, is it, that we've sent to you?
Yes.
This
I mean, we obviously our questions based on the pack that you've sent to us.
I'm just trying to
get to the.
because I know we've just changed.
It was the definitions that we received, so we're using.
That's it.
And as well,
and
what
that's-
wasn't clear, there is what percentage the numbers that are there represent, because we've seen the numbers, but we
here.
didn't know exactly how much were the total handling of services and how many of those are.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know it's this one.
Yeah, that's it.
So I found it. I was just trying to work out where it was.
Sure.
So yes, the unable to resolve, that is definitely one that we've looked at the definition to resolve, because that makes it comes across that we are unable to resolve the complaint, not such. Sometimes there are complaints that come through that aren't about government services. So how that was categorised and defined was misleading as such. So the new definition is about ones that we weren't unable to, they're not government related, but that we have signposted or sent on to a different organisation. Because the public just provides feedback. So sometimes we get feedback about parishes.
I understand, but if there are complaints about the health services, about the hospital provision, and they were not resolved,
Yes, I suppose what I think we're trying
This
to, and I
bit,
can't, yes, I can't find the bit I'm looking for specifically, but I suppose we've recognised that we're giving information to the executive leadership team, to yourselves, saying that there's this volume of complaints that are unable to resolve. What we recognise is that that's actually a misleading title, because it's not within that bucket of numbers is actually a few different things within there. So we've actually changed now going forward. It's called something different.
But I think that we'll need to iron definition through our communication.
Yes.
When we write the report, we'll
yes.
address this.
Okay.
My question was, what steps are you taking to ensure that the number of unresolved or unable resolved complaints in infrastructure and environment will come down?
So
This is the question.
Yeah, so that's about, and so I suppose for us, what's important is we look at, in the same way as we look at resolved complaints or
What
suggestions,
have
but-
you done till now to resolve, to bring down the numbers?
So I thought you'd said that 97% of them were not resolved.
That was within the timescale. That's it. So it's a slightly different of those that were resolved.
Can I just add with the
Yes,
INE
please,
question? With the INE question, those unable to resolve, a significant proportion of them were in relation to Fort Regent queries and feedback. So they were about the movement. So obviously when INE took that feedback, there was lots of things in terms of people being unhappy with Springfield Gym, for example. So there were things that nothing could be done about as such, because the Springfield Gym was the Springfield Gym that customers had to use. So we saw a peak in terms of increase in feedback received, and that's why they fell into the category, some of them, of unable to resolve, because obviously the movement, that was a decision that had been made and they weren't able to change the decision. Not that they're not looking at the feedback, but obviously it was the movement, it was the physical movement.
But it would be actually very interesting to see this feedback, because we are moving into Fort Regent again, and it will be again lots of complaints about if the feedback hasn't been addressed and people didn't take in consideration what public thinks about Fort Regent or Springfield, we will come again.
It was listened to, so INE have listened to it, but that's why it's misleading the category of where it's fallen into on the system. That's all.
Yeah. So
Just a minute.
Particularly to this volume of complaints for infrastructure and environment. Do you have the breakdown of this unresolved one? How many were actually normally directed to the parish but came to the infrastructure, things like that? Because I think that also adds up to
I think we'll follow up with to make it sure that we are on the same page and we're asking correct question. We'll follow up with our written question. This two more questions for the next 2 minutes that remain on different theme. In the letter that you sent to to the PAC from Chief Executive on the 25th of October, it was stated there is no central record of how government has responded to the complaints board recommendations from the perspective of your department, which has ownership of the department complaints. Would there any challenges in maintaining a central record for the government responses for the complaints board recommendations?
I think, yeah, from my perspective, I think now yes, over 5 years was probably thinking, well, actually, that's, our team has evolved. We've changed a lot over the last 5 years. Certainly now we do, when I think of sort of State's Complaints Board findings this year, for example, my understanding is there's been 2. They've, both of those have had the recommendations sort of taken on board, and that's something that actually as a customer experience board as well, we sort of make sure we look at those and actually are there any wider learnings from that corporate angle. So I think it is important that the findings from any sort of State's Complaints Board panel are sort of looked at, lessons learned, worked on. So I think we can. I think it was probably over the last 5 years, suddenly it was kind of like, well, actually, crumbs, there's not no one person has a list of every recommendation. Yep. But I think going forward, that's something certainly from our perspective, and that's certainly something that we can look to, so for the ones that have taken place this year, we're aware of, even though we're not actually responsible for the actual response or recommendations, we still will look at through a certain lens. So we'd be happy to
so even without, now we don't have centralized record, would your department would start to take an ownership and file and to address through the board or through ALT meetings? Or it's something that you need to discuss to see how we actually keep in a track of recommendations?
I think we do already with ELT have a kind of state of play with.
Who's in charge? Who's the ownership?
That's it. So I suppose that's it we see that almost the State's Complaints Board is very much with each chief officer, as it were. But I can see that it might make sense to have, within our remit that we've also got
so much already.
That's it. It's kind of like, for us to almost keep a remit. We're not responsible for solving and acting on those recommendations. That rests still with relevant ministers and departments, but we can certainly keep a close, and there's not that many of them, fortunately, that this would become something that's too onerous, I don't think.
We hear lots of improvements that really was made, and they're welcome over the last 3 years, follow recommendations and implementations. I would ask about 3 top improvements that around handling feedback and complaint system that you are working currently or planning to work in 2025, what it would be.
So as in things that we still want to
yes.
To
what
do.
are you working? What's your?
Can I?
Yes. Do you want to do one?
So, as I referred to before, is the accessibility piece. So, one of the things is making sure that our policy and how people provide feedback on Ireland is as accessible as it can be. So, obviously, we're looking.
What's missing?
So, currently, at the moment, the next step we're looking at easy read version. So that's the next one. But obviously this is about the continuous feedback to make sure that it's as accessible as can be. Mm-hmm. That's one area.
I think, a continuing focus for the year ahead is, we're in early days with child-friendly feedback and schools and working with them. And I think we know that they're, with all of these things, it takes time to get those used. So I think that remains a key priority to focus on. And I also do think something that's very easy to kind of get. So when we talk about feedback, to get very focused on complaints. But I think there is a really important piece to play about actually letting the public know actually even more actually what is happening. And actually there's so much actual positivity as well that I think we don't particularly sort of shout about. We've got some really good customer satisfaction, but I think that, you know, this year we've published the, based on a recommendation, you know, we've published for the first time the kind of in an easier format, some sort of overview of customer feedback. But I think there's, you know, that's something we want to, you know, really continue to build on as well, both, you know, from a positive perspective as well, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions from members?
Something left?
So, give me 3 reasons, only 3, why I should have confidence in the system. Short, succinct, 3 reasons.
I suppose it's, you know, it's the right thing to do. I think we're all on the same. We're all on the same page here. We're not. This isn't where there's a difference of opinion. We all want to do this better for customers. We want to. Ultimately, good service is better for islanders, but also more efficient. When we get things wrong is when it costs government money. And so the more we focus on getting it right and getting it right first time, ultimately we are reputationally, financially, we're all in a better position.
Only got 1 to go.
Yes, and so it was about something that's
Why should I have confidence?
confidence. I suppose, I think actually we've got a track record of when I look back to where we were 5 years ago and how year on year we've kept improving this. You know, we have delivered on, you know, the recommendations that have come through. We're actually getting that positive feedback. So I suppose I think our track record is that you can trust us that we're not going to let this drop. You know,
Okay,
this is
fine.
important to us.
No, thank you very much. It's really, really reassuring. It was helpful for us to hear, and I hope the members of the public would be reassured, and they will come forward and will submit feedback to the services that they receive.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for all officers, CNG and members,
you.
and its public hearing is closed.